Thanks to all who have joined for our presentation this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you might be. Building bridges at the border, working for justice, and acting for peace. We are so gratified to see so many in Loretto and beyond Loretto on the call today. I'm Sally Dunn, a Loretto co-member and a member of Loretto's Latin America Caribbean Committee, one of the 4 entities collaborating on this event. The others are the Loretto Volunteer Program, Loretto at the UN's office, and the Feminist Task Force. Our moderator today is Rosa Lizarde. Rosa is a Mexican-American feminist advocating for economic, environmental, gender, and racial justice. She currently serves as the Global Director for the Feminist Task Force, a global women's rights coalition calling for gender equality to end poverty, founded in the year 2005. Rosa and I worked closely together when I had Beth Blissman's position at the UN. So she's a close friend, and she does marvelous work. She's also a member of the Latin America Caribbean Committee. So we continue to work together. Her advocacy, policy, and campaigning experience has been honed at the UN and through global processes focusing on women's economic justice, poverty eradication, and women's rights. Rosa, you have the floor.
I want to welcome everyone, and I want to wish everyone good health. I hope everyone is doing well during this time, and I hope everyone is safe during this time of coronavirus. This event, Building Bridges at the Border, Working for Justice, Acting for Peace, was planned for the 64th Commission on the Status of Women, also referred to by its initials, the CSW. By way of background, the CSW is an annual 2-week meeting convened by the United Nations to review a pre-agreed program of work on gender equality and women's rights. This year, the CSW was to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women, which took place in Beijing, China in 1995. The Beijing Conference produced the Beijing Declaration and the Beijing Platform for Action, the most progressive blueprint ever for advancing women's rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. The Beijing process unleashed remarkable political will and worldwide visibility on women's rights and the advancement of women and girls. Regrettably, the CSW in its usual form never took place. It was the first in a series of meetings that the UN postponed or canceled due to the threat of the coronavirus and the outbreak of COVID-19. Over 12,000 had pre-registered to attend this meeting. Over 600 events had been organized, all of which were canceled or postponed, including our event. Fortunately, we are able to bring our event on a virtual platform. Our event focuses on presenting current information on the status of migrant women and those held in detention, primarily in the locations where we have had presence at the US-Mexico border, have been present by working, visiting, organizing with partners, and hosting border trips for the past 13 years. As a guiding document, we had referred to the Beijing Platform for Action to root this event with historical context with regards to migrant and refugee women and girls. The Beijing Platform for Action has highlighted migrant women in their 12 critical areas of concern. We knew that then, as it is now, that the migration issue was an important one, enough to highlight in the Beijing Platform for Action. Women were migrating, escaping poverty, moving due to violence, escaping high inequality and lack of economic opportunities. In very much the same way, we see the same issues as root causes of migration from Latin American countries, mainly from Central America and Mexico to the United States. While this geopolitical situation at the border has existed for over 150 years, migration is still occurring at an elevated rate due to increased violence, political upheaval, violence against women and girls, increased poverty and inequality, trafficking of drugs and persons, 70% of which are estimated to be women and girls, and the lack of economic opportunity. Now, we can add climate change and the persecution of LGBTQI persons as root causes of migration. The drought in the dry corridor of Central America, including sections of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and a small portion of Costa Rica, have been a trigger for migration and has increased significantly the last 5 years. The majority of those migrating across the US-Mexico border are men, mainly young men, some of whom are fleeing homophobia and increased persecution based on sexual orientation or gender identity. With regards to the Beijing Platform for Action, it stipulates that government must provide protection, assistance, and training to refugee women, other displaced women in need of international protection, and internally displaced women. It also states that governments must apply international norms to ensure equal access and equal treatment of women and men in refugee determination procedures and the granting of asylum, including full respect and strict observation of the principle of non-refoulement, which is the practice of not forcing refugees or asylum seekers to return to a country in which they are liable to be subjected to persecution. Moreover, it states that bringing national immigration regulations into conformity with relevant international instruments and consider recognizing as refugees those women whose claim to refugee status is based on the well-founded fear of persecution for reasons enumerated in the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. This includes persecution through sexual violence or other gender-related persecution. The Beijing Platform for Action is a non-binding agreement at the UN. However, there are numerous binding international human rights instruments which call for the protection of migrants and refugees, beginning with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its preamble in Article 16 and Article 25. Others include the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW, and its optional protocol. Moreover, the recent global goals adopted by the United Nations in 2015, more formally known as the Sustainable Development Goals, stipulate the protection and promotion of safety and security for migrant workers, in particular women migrants, and those in precarious situations in employment. The U.S. has been a signatory to certain treaties and conference agreements, such as the Beijing Platform for Action. However, the U.S. has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, nor CEDAW, and is negligent of addressing the migrant and refugee issue in compliance with international human rights instruments. The situation at the Mexico-US border has reached critical proportions since the election of the current administration in 2016. The situation is escalating and growing worse by the month, particularly for women and children now getting stuck at the border, getting in detention camps and detention centers, which are in essence jails. They are now waiting months for asylum and held in limbo. Servicing these communities is necessary yet challenging. In late February of this year, the U.S. Appeals Court blocked the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP program, which sent asylum seekers back to Mexico to await the outcome of their case. On February 28th of this year, the U.S. closed the border in Ciudad Juarez, across from El Paso, to prevent migrants from crossing after the decision on MPP. Moreover, we are now being hit by a crisis that knows no borders. It doesn't distinguish between men, women, or children, between wealthy or impoverished, between a person of color and a person who lacks color, between a documented or undocumented person. This we know too well as the coronavirus, which we know no wall can keep out, even the jail walls of the detention centers where women and men are being held awaiting their asylum. This morning, there is news that the Defense Department is deploying an additional 540 troops to the U.S. border with Mexico to keep migrants potentially infected with the coronavirus COVID-19 from entering the country. The additional military forces were requested by the Department of Homeland Security to help seal off the U.S. border for migrants who may be carrying the virus. Through the hands-on work at the border for over a decade, the Loretto community has brought solidarity, support, and service. We will hear from these panelists about the latest information from members of the Latin American and Caribbean community and Loretto Volunteers who have been providing support to migrants and our partners at the border. Panelists will provide firsthand knowledge and analysis from the border, what a border experience entails, who are our partners at the border and how we work with them, and how donations can help and be funneled to humanitarian organizations. I first want to introduce the next two speakers, and we'll come back to introduce the other panelists. The first two speakers will focus on the border trips, what they are like, what they entail, provide description, and also an update about the situation with regard to what's happening at the border where we work. You heard Sally Dunn, but let me reintroduce Sally for those who might not have caught her introduction at the beginning. Sally Dunn, the first speaker, served as UN representative of Loretto at the UN from 2008 through 2016. Her advocacy focused on human rights, including the rights of women and girls and the rights of migrants. Since leaving the UN position, she has been an active member of Loretto's Latin America Caribbean Committee, helping to organize and lead Loretto's border experience trips to the US border. Following her, we will have Mary Jean Friel. Mary Jean is a lifelong immigrant and peace activist who began her work with the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. As a Loretto co-member, she has devoted her time serving on the Peace Committee and the Latin American Caribbean Committee. She is the longest serving member of the LACC currently and is the main organizer of the border experience trips. And she is a mentor of mine, and I really treasure both Sally and Mary Jean's friendship and mentorship. So Sally, you're up.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I likewise have been mentored by Mary Jean Friel. I think she's mentored all of us in Loretto along this path. So I'm going to first talk about, give you an ever so brief history of Loretto at the border, and then I'm going to describe the basic elements of these Loretto border experience trips that we've been conducting. So as far as the history of Loretto at the border is concerned, our presence primarily has been concentrated in two locales, the El Paso Juarez border and the Tucson, Nogales, Arizona / Nogales, Sonora, Mexico region. In El Paso, Loretto has a long history that began actually in the late 1800s. Loretto Academy which was founded in 1923, still educates pre-K through 12th grade students in El Paso. In 2007, Sisters of Loretto founded in El Paso Villa Maria, which is a home where women who are homeless and whose children are not with them can transition from crisis to self-sufficiency while living within a safe, supportive, and spiritual community. The Loretto community has collaborated with and supported Annunciation House in El Paso for many years. And during the humanitarian crisis unfolding at the border for the last couple of years, Sisters of Loretto and co-members of Loretto from all across the country have volunteered time, energy, and money to help Annunciation House provide services to migrants seeking asylum in the U.S. 2 years ago, the Loretto Volunteer Program expanded to El Paso, and this year we have 3 volunteers serving there. 2 of them are with us today to tell us about the organizations they work with. So our other concentration at the border, as I mentioned, is in the Tucson, Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Mexico section. As Rosa mentioned, for the last 13 years or so, Loretto's Latin America Caribbean Committee, the LACC, has been conducting trips to the U.S.-Mexico border at Nogales. These border trips started out as opportunities for Loretto members to learn about the conditions at the border and to provide whatever service and support we could to immigrants being apprehended and deported. Over the years, our Loretto border experience has expanded to groups outside of Loretto who seek ways to become involved in seeking justice at the border. And here is why we do this. The Loretto border journey is a transformative immersion experience that seeks justice and peace at the U.S.-Mexico border. Through direct encounter with migrants and justice workers navigating an inhumane immigration system, participants learn to be a healing presence, a source of hope, and a force for change. Our border experience is based on 3 key points of our philosophy. The first element is witness. We believe in the power of showing up. Bearing witness to injustice is itself a moral act. Hope. We believe in the radical power of hope in the face of grave injustice. A more just world is possible for broken systems and the many people who suffer because of them. And friendship. We believe in the transformative power of personal encounter, relationships with migrants, with justice workers, and with fellow participants energize and sustain our commitments. And here's a comment I wanted to share with you, just one comment from one of our past participants. Quote, I felt quite removed from the border crisis, and I wanted to know firsthand what was really happening, and perhaps why so many people are risking everything to make this dangerous journey. I wanted to witness this crisis and to share with others my experience. I love that quote because that captures precisely why we think this is important work for us to do, to bring people so they can witness and then share with others what they saw and experienced. The elements of a border trip typically include witnessing a process called Operation Streamline at the federal courthouse in Tucson. Every afternoon, approximately 75 migrants are ushered into the federal courtroom, 10 to 12 at a time, all wearing shackles, each having had a few minutes, if they're lucky, to speak to a lawyer. In less than 2 hours, the judge hears each person plead guilty and sentences each to either prison time or immediate deportation. It's a difficult thing to witness, let me tell you. And it's quite efficient, but it's what we tell ourselves represents due process for these people. Usually the next day we drive about an hour from Tucson south to Nogales. We park our cars and walk across the border into Nogales, Mexico. The day in Mexico is spent helping to serve meals to migrants, visiting shelters, and hearing people's stories. Listening to their stories is such a gift to us and to them. And it's not unusual for us to encounter people whom we saw just the day before in the courthouse being ordered to be deported. An organization we partner with escorts our group on a desert walk along one of many routes used by migrants who attempt to cross in the desert. We leave jugs of water along the way, and we get a tiny sense of the challenges faced and the desperation felt by those who walk in the desert at night. On our last border trip in November, we were blessed by the generosity of our friend Bob Key, who arranged for us to visit with women held in the Eloy detention prison near Tucson. We broke into small groups of 3. I was with Maureen Flanagan and Rosa Lizarde, and we spent about an hour in conversation, with Rosa translating for me and Maureen, with a woman named Helen, hearing her story, laughing and crying with her, and laughing through the tears, hearing of her fears and the dehumanizing treatment by the guards, and somehow the hope she was clinging to. She told us that hope is the last thing to go. Bob later told us that Helen's family in New Jersey was able to gather the remaining funds needed to bond her out of Eloy. Loretto had contributed some of these funds as well. And funds come from all over the place. And so for this one person, adequate funds were gathered, and Helen was able to join her family in New Jersey, where she is now awaiting her asylum hearing. Her story is, of course, just one of tens of thousands, each one representing a person or family whose human rights have been violated in ways large and small by our government in our name. There are many organizations in the Tucson-Nogales region with whom we collaborate. They support us when we bring groups on border trips, and we support them with our solidarity and with our funds as we are able. We almost always bring contributions of money from Loretto's Hunger Fund, Loretto's Special Needs Fund, and from our LACC budget to support the work they do. And we ask participants to bring funds for donations as well. So here's a list that Amy's gonna show you of, I think, most of our partner organizations. I may have missed some, and I apologize to those I might have, but you can see that there are really quite a few. No More Deaths is an organization whose mission is to help migrants lost, injured, and dying in the desert. People Helping People are residents of a small town, village in Arivaca, Arizona, which has become kind of a center of an area where migrants attempt to cross in the border, and so they're practically occupied by the Border Patrol. Cruzando Fronteras is an Episcopal diocese ministry engaged in both advocacy and providing direct service and support for migrants, refugees, and detainees. Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, one of the original sanctuary movement churches whose leaders and members continue the struggle for justice for all. The Kino Border Initiative is a collaboration between the Jesuits, the Missionary Sisters of the Holy Eucharist, and the Diocese of Tucson and the Diocese of Nogales. And their mission is to promote U.S.-Mexico border and immigration policies that affirm the dignity of the human person. Tucson Samaritans, through daily treks into the desert, they provide emergency medical assistance, food, and water to migrants in distress. The Florence Project, oh, I missed one, Freedom Fund, is a project making small grants to people detained at Eloy Detention Center to help in their daily needs, and when possible, larger grants to help in bonding out detainees so they can join their families while waiting for their asylum hearings. The Florence Project is a legal service organization in Arizona, providing free legal and social services to adults and unaccompanied children in immigration, custody, and facing removal proceedings. RAICES is a large legal services organization in San Antonio, providing pro bono representation for families and children in detention and assistance to asylum seekers, DACA youth, and others. And we've included the Immigrant Freedom Fund of Colorado, not specifically one of our partners in our border trip, but an LACC member, Maureen Flanagan, is very active with this Colorado Freedom Fund. It is a volunteer-run organization working to bond out immigrants placed in detention by ICE in Aurora. Maureen has facilitated Loretto making some contributions to this organization as well to help in bonding out. And as I said, I'm sure there might be others that I'm forgetting. So to sum up, I will just tell you that the LACC was planning 2 border trips this spring, one in April for a group of California women activists that Carolyn Yaramillo hangs with, and one in May for Narings Hall alums. But we've had to postpone both of them due to the coronavirus pandemic. We hope to reschedule them for later this year. Each time we have a border trip, we find conditions have worsened in substantial ways. Bearing witness to the increasing and deepening injustice we encounter has become very difficult emotionally, but it is needed now more than ever. Mary Jean will now give you a glimpse of what the current conditions are.
I'll speak briefly about what is happening at our border in Arizona and most recently in California, and the shelters and detention prisons that LACC is involved with. As you probably know, the borders are closed for Americans and tourists, anybody who wants to come. At the Arizona border, Cruzando Fronteras is able to go with a diplomatic passport. Roger, who is our contact there, works in 2 shelters, La Roca and La Casa for All Nations. And right at this time, they have about 200 plus families. Keno Border Initiative, they are still feeding migrants twice a day, even though no volunteers or immersion groups can go to help. The volunteers are wearing masks and gloves, and the migrants come to the door one at a time to receive their food. They are asked if they can to bring their own utensils, and if not, they're given disposable plates. Their Keno initiative has an update every week or 2 weeks, and you can get that on Facebook. Okay, most recently, as far as shelters go, is in Tijuana, Mexico. My son Michael has been working with a shelter that is sponsored by the Salesians of Don Bosco. Their shelter this week increased from 800 meals every morning to 1,500. The increase, they feel, is that people are being deported back into Mexico. Tijuana, according to Mike, has shelter in place, and no longer can he go without a passport. LACC also works, like Sally said, with No More Deaths. And No More Deaths every day sends people to take water and needed food for the people who are still crossing the desert. They also are leading the campaign which is called Free Them All. And that they're asking us, call your senators and representatives, tell them to free all the people out of the detention prisons. And you could also mention that it's our taxpayer money paying for these private detentions, you know, and it's not right. Now, the detention prisons, as they are right now, no one can go. They're sealed off, and they, no lawyers. All the lawyers can do is talk by phone with their clients. And there are pictures on, I think it's the Florence Project website, that shows there's a woman in here sick, very sick, and but they are still hearing cases. And Bob told me yesterday that the immigrants in Eloy, where we have visited, like Sally said, are still getting out on asylum. And a couple got out, I think it was yesterday or Tuesday. The Florence Project and the Freedom Fund both work with La Palma and Eloy. And Loretto is helping both of these groups in bonding out people. The Florence Project, they're trying to get them released on humanitarian need. So we can just keep hoping they get out. In Denver, the Aurora prison, as of Tuesday, 100 plus have been released. Maureen Flanagan, our LACC member there, is helping remotely, getting food, tickets, and clothes for the immigrants' journey to their sponsor. She also said that there was a car parade going around the state capitol demanding that the governor release all the immigrants from the prison. In San Antonio, where Raíces is located, Jill Severinsky, a former Loretto volunteer, has let us know that the 3 detention prisons there have said no one at all will be released. Raíces filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security to get families released on humanitarian grounds. Jill also was working at a feed bank that feeds 3,000 people a day. And just to remember that, you know, with what the government has passed, right now in our country, migrant men and women are working in the fields to get food for us. And do they have all the protective gear? Are they 6 feet apart? No, they're not. And LACC works with National Farm Worker Ministry, ROCKS works with them. Also in Tucson with Southside Presbyterian Church, we have Eileen Harrington, and they, of course, like all of us here, everything is shut down, but they're still struggling to work with the very poor of Tucson, especially the undocumented. And now I know that, you know, it's hard for us to have what's happening at the border because it changes every day. But we're very lucky to have some who can work with the migrants every day.
Thank you, both Sally and Mary Jean. I think you've mentioned a lot of organizations there. Some are small, some are very well equipped, like the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, Raíces, that you mentioned. Now, our next speakers have been at the front lines of the border crisis as volunteers in El Paso. They will provide information about their work with detainees, as well as personal narratives about what it's like for them to be in a high stress, physically, emotional, tense environment. So let me introduce Ana Avendano. She's a Mexican-American youth activist from Chicago, Illinois, working as a Loretto volunteer at Las Americas Community Advocacy Center in El Paso, Texas. She studied political science and economics at Loyola University in Illinois. And Kiara Quintanar is a Mexican-American youth activist from San Francisco, California, working at the Cali Center for Hunger Relief, which provides services to migrants in the El Paso area. She studied justice, community, and leadership, and minored in sociology at St. Mary's College of California. So I believe Ana is first, and then will be followed by Kiara.
So I work at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. We're one of the few pro bono legal services for asylum seekers and migrants in El Paso. I'm a legal assistant for the team that works with the detained population. So I'm basically going to talk about how we've been dealing with everything that's been going on in the past few months, what our response has been, what we have seen at the detention centers. Basically, like, what I hope that you will get out of this is that ICE is unamendable and it operates with no supervision, no accountability, and it should not be an institution that is allowed to operate or work with any population. So first of all, before the coronavirus, what really affected our team was a movement of people from El Paso. We work with people detained at Otero County in New Mexico and people detained at El Paso Processing Center in El Paso. And what happened I think only about a month before the coronavirus and everything started getting shut down because of that, we had about half of El Paso Processing Center was transferred out. So El Paso Processing Center can hold about 800 people, and right now there's only 400 people there. Out of 20 of our clients, 13 people were transferred out to other parts of the country, and that's true for everyone, like throughout, like all legal service providers. So if someone had hired a lawyer to provide a service and they were transferred out, that's money they lost. And according to ICE's own handbook, you're not allowed to transfer out people who have lawyers, who have legal representation, unless it's absolutely necessary, but we were never given a reason for the transfer of people. There were people that we're about to have their final hearing in a few weeks or in 1 week, and they were transferred out and their hearings got rescheduled. So that's more time that they have to spend in detention because the file needs to be transferred to the new detention center, and all their hearings were cleared. They had to start all over. So that's what hit us first. And then we started talking to our clients who got moved. They were moved to Louisiana, to Joe Corley Processing Center in Conroe, Texas, to Northwest Detention Center in Washington State, and to a couple others, one in Georgia. But we started hearing stories from them, and what we heard was that in Louisiana, for example, they were only being given oatmeal 3 times a day to eat. In Joe Corley, we had a client that suffered a fall in El Paso Processing Center because the shoes she was given were too big. She requested to have different shoes. She was never given a response, so she fell. She had a slipped disc in her spine. When she was moved, she was scared to ask for medical help because one of her cellmates told her that if you complained or if you asked for anything, you could be sent to isolation. So she's supposed to be on 3 different medications, one for pain, and she's not given any of them. She's scared to ask for help, to ask for any medical attention. We also have a couple of people with asthma, which they're especially vulnerable right now with the pandemic. They weren't giving inhalers. We have someone who is epileptic. He suffered a seizure at night. Thankfully, it was very mild, so he was able to recover. But when he went to go ask for medical help, they refused to help him because they only spoke English. They didn't speak Spanish. And they didn't get anyone to translate. Nobody knows that he's had a seizure. He hasn't been able to communicate it. He's not getting the medicine he needs, so it's very likely that it will happen again, and who knows how severe it will be. And we also hear that, well, none of the detention centers have soap. They're not given hand soap. They're allowed a small portion of shampoo to shower, to disinfect, to wash their hands, but they're not given soap. They're given vinegar to clean their beds, their barracks, but it's just one bucket of vinegar for everyone. So basically where I'm going with this is that if someone were to happen, if there was a case of coronavirus, an outbreak, it would not be contained. Under these conditions, it's just asking for a disaster to happen. We've also heard that some people only get 1 square of toilet paper every time they go to the bathroom. So this was all before the pandemic and everything started to be shut down. So now what we're really concerned about is if anything were to happen, ICE could not contain this. ICE could not prevent deaths in detention centers. So how we're operating, essentially, like we're not allowed to go in. At Otero, legal service providers can go in with masks, gloves, and glasses, but we don't have any of that given that we're a nonprofit. So we have to communicate by phone. However, ICE has not cooperated with that either. At Otero, we've tried multiple times to call our clients. One time we were told that the wind was too strong, so the phone lines weren't working. However, a couple minutes later, after we tried to make the call, the client himself called us from the barracks, from their phone, using their own money, and they called us and the call went through. So I don't know why ICE told us that the wind was too strong to make a call at Otero when clearly it wasn't. So we're really struggling with that. The courts have not responded well. Also, another point that I wanted to make was with MPP, since the MPP has remained in Mexico, where they have to wait for their asylum hearing in Juarez or wherever Mexico. So all of the court dates have been suspended. That means that anyone who is in Mexico is forced to remain there for longer, is still extremely vulnerable, especially like women, families, single mothers, children. All of them are especially vulnerable in Mexico, and they're just forced to wait for longer. We've had clients that have suffered acid attacks. We had a young woman who suffered an acid attack in Mexico. She crossed the border again to ask for help, to ask for a non-refoulement interview, so that they would let her into the country and not force her to go back to Mexico. But she was denied even coming into the interview with the scars, with her skin barely healing. She was denied and sent back to Mexico. So that means that all of those people, they're forced to stay in Mexico, they're forced to stay there for longer, and they don't have access to healthcare in Mexico. The Mexican government gives them a card to get healthcare, but it's only valid for, I think, about a couple of months. So now that it's postponed, they're forced to wait there without access to healthcare and being especially vulnerable. We're trying right now to get people out on parole. Asking ICE that they let them out, because essentially if anything were to happen, if there were any cases of coronavirus inside a detention center, it would not be contained and they would suffer like extreme consequences because of it. So we're trying to get people out on humanitarian parole. However, the responses we have gotten from ICE so far have not been positive. We've heard our client, like the deportation officers, which are in charge of determining parole for a detained person, are not in communication with us, but they do communicate often with our clients. And what they have told our clients is that they will not let them out unless they're about to die. And that's quote unquote what a deportation officer told a client. Unless they're about to die, they don't care about their situation. and they're not scared to say whatever they want because they know that nobody cares and nobody's going to do anything about it, and they can operate however they want. We haven't gotten a single parole approved. They've come up with multiple excuses, such as they don't have like sufficient identification to be let out after we submit their birth certificate and their identity card. They just always look for different excuses not to let people out. So at this point, it's a ticking time bomb, and unless the courts are willing to do anything about it, ICE will never do anything about it. And there have been we've heard that there's been suspected cases in different detention centers, but ICE will also not confirm whether or not like there have been cases. It's just what we know is what we hear from our clients, from our people, and there is no accountability to ICE to report or to let us know about conditions.
Thank you, Anna. Let's give Kira an opportunity as well to speak. Thank you.
As mentioned before, we're Loretto Volunteers and here in El Paso, Texas. And I wanted to just start off by explaining why I chose to do my year here. I think everyone on this call is probably interested about immigration and the crisis on the border. And I as well, I'm very passionate about it. And I'm from the Bay Area in California, but I didn't really know like what to do. I felt very far away from the migrant crisis, and I think the breaking point for me to stop just looking at articles and actually do something was when family separation began. And so we're a little over halfway through our service year here in El Paso, and I wanted to share just 3 narratives that I've learned through my job and through volunteering at different migrant and asylum or services that support migrants and asylum seekers. I wanted to start off with sharing actually about family separation. I volunteer at one of the Annunciation houses that was mentioned earlier that's called Casa del Refugiado. Right now, they're currently actually shut down because of how low the numbers are. Some of the other Annunciation houses are still working, but the largest one is currently closed because of low numbers. And so I believed for a moment that family separation wasn't happening anymore because the zero tolerance policy was lifted. But actually family separation is still very much happening in other ways. One of the ways I've met a few families, but I'll just share one of their stories at Casa del Refugiado. It was a mother, a father, and a son and a daughter that were crossing. They spent many months in Juarez, Mexico, and for the Migrant Protection Protocol, Remain in Mexico policy. And when they were finally being processed, the father and wife went first. The younger son, who's about 12 years old, went, and the last person to go through was their 18-year-old daughter. And in that moment, they were not aware of this because the daughter was not a minor. She was 18 years old. She was separated from the family and said she needed to be processed separately. So they were instantly separated. They did not have any time to say goodbye. They didn't know this was going to happen. And, the parents and the son went to a holding facility, and their daughter went to a completely different detention center. And so I met them at the shelter, and when they were just like, what do we do? How do I leave my daughter? Where is she? Is she safe? When are we going to be able to talk to her? But also needing to go to where their sponsor is, which is was in a different state, because they had a court hearing within, I think, 5 or 6 days. And so that story and that family has really stuck with me. And I just wanted to just share that family separation is really still happening and how much that isn't fair. Another narrative I wanted to share. So I work at the Fresh Start program within the Kelly Center for Hunger Relief, and we try to have an approach, a more comprehensive approach to food insecurity. And one of those things include case management in this program. And I help with case management, and one of our members of the program has a pathway to citizenship through the Violence Against Women Act. And I think this story is important to share because this is a common narrative of people fleeing violence from whatever country they're fleeing and then arriving here in the United States. And we have a system that's really set up for more trauma and violence to happen through the migrant protections protocols while people are living for months and months very vulnerable in Mexico, through detention centers. And then once we know outside of detention centers, what kind of jobs can they get, are exploitative jobs, and then vulnerability to violence. And so while she was fleeing violence, again, when the United States in the first few months here was a victim of violence. And fortunately, we do have this pathway to citizenship through the Act, but at the same time, it is frustrating that, you know, this pathway is only because she has, again, has experienced violence. And so yeah, that was another narrative. And the last one that I want to share is, I know that this event was for the Commission on the Status of Women, and I also care very much about women and children, but another vulnerable population that Rosa mentioned earlier was the LGBT community, specifically transgender folks, transgender women. And I got to meet one of Anna's clients that was released and bonded out. We took them to the store and then to the airport, and this man is very sweet, and he's really stuck with me as well. And he identifies as a gay man. And right now he's adjusting to his new home with his sponsor. And I'm thinking a lot about how maybe soon he could run out of medication that he takes for mental health, and how he has to wait 150 days before he can legally have a work permit. And I'm thinking about how difficult it is to access resources and how the difficulty has heightened because of the coronavirus. And, you know, thinking about whatever trauma and experiences that made him flee his country, and then everything he experienced in Juarez, and then also in the detention centers. And then after all of this, you know, he's still very much in the state of limbo because there's up to 3 court hearings, and this can take anywhere from like about 6 months to a year and a half. There's no like exact timeline. And so in that whole time, when you're adjusting and trying to figure everything out and heal, you can still be deported after all of this time and after all of this process. So I hope these narratives can, you know, give you a different perspective that maybe you've heard, or maybe just enforce, you know, along with Anna, how really terrible our process is for migrants and asylum seekers. And one thing I took away so far from my year here is I felt really far away from the border and felt like I'm useless if I'm not here on the border. And while, you know, there's so many ways to volunteer and experience the border, I myself went on an immersion trip to Tijuana, San Diego, and that really like influenced my passion for this issue. But there's so much to do outside. People are being flown out to their sponsors everywhere in the United States, big cities, rural areas, and they really need support in that process as well. And so I just like want to encourage, you know, for people that care about this, that there's so many ways to help with legal representation, with donating for WIN bonds that I've seen even up to $20,000 in bonds. And it says $25,000 in bonds. So, you know, they have to stay in detention unless they can get that money, which is ridiculous. And then once they get there and they're placed in their cities with their sponsors, they still need support and resources. And so I encourage you all as I figure that out as well. And that's what I wanted to share with you all today.
Thank you so much, Kiara and Anna. And I think it's so important that the message that you're giving to not only us older folks, but to young people, you know, that inspiration, because those of us who have been on the border trips know how tense and stressful, and how witnessing, you know, what happens at these border trip experiences, how emotional it can be. But to be there day in and day out like you're doing, kudos to you for doing that. So let us move on to our last presenters, and these are my colleagues at the UN. Amy Maltz is a youth activist from Salem, Oregon. She studied ethnic studies at the University of San Diego. Amy was part of the first cohort of Loretto Volunteers in El Paso, Texas, so she has spent time there as well, and is currently in her second year as a volunteer at the New York City office of Loretto at the UN. And Beth Flissman currently serves as the Loretto Community NGO representative to the United Nations. She has been a Loretto co-member for nearly 25 years and has enjoyed working in higher education prior to that, with an emphasis in community engagement for several decades before coming to New York. A certified permaculturist, Beth's passions include addressing both social and environmental justice challenges simultaneously through experiential education opportunities, multilateral diplomacy, and biomimicry. So I will leave it to Amy, who will be moderating the Q&A. Let us know how we're going to do this, and then also Beth, who will be informing us about resources and how we can help.
But I do want to open it up to attendees who have questions for any of our panelists. And I actually have a question first, and I hope it's okay that I kind of start this off. But I just want to hear, a little from Kiara and Anna. Some of the work that all of the work that you both are doing is so exhausting and draining, and the situations and experiences that you hear from the people you work with. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how you take care of yourself during this time. So I'll start it off with that question and then reopen it up to the rest of our attendees to ask them questions as well.
Okay, I'll go first. I think that's a question for probably a lot of people that do activist work, that it's difficult, and it's not a simple answer. Luckily, I live in community with Anna and Celine, and so we can talk to each other. We understand each other's experiences on some level, and I think also through this year I've found a lot of inspiration from migrants and their faith and how incredibly resilient they are. And so I find some level of comfort in seeing how hopeful and resilient they are, and I try to keep that with me as well. So
I think with the work I do, I'm constantly getting calls, constantly hearing about these awful things that are happening to people. I go, I'm the one that writes their declaration of why they're seeking asylum. I go through their whole story. So it's a lot of secondhand trauma. But I think when you're in the midst of doing all this work and when you're getting calls all the time and you feel like I am connected to these people and connected to, I know everything that happens to them. So how could I not continue? Even through the, I may be tired, the exhaustion, it's always gonna keep me going, because how could you not do anything about it when you're constantly hearing about it? And I think, she said, it really helps to be in community and to have other people around me that are doing the same work, because then we can talk to each other and de-stress and share different coping mechanisms to this, and know that we're even though the work may be hard and the work may be often impossible, we're not the only ones fighting for it.
Definitely. Thank you. I just want to say again, thank you both for sharing. Both Anna and Kiara are continuing to work in the midst of this pandemic. So I just want to, again, just say thank you so much for being on the call today. I want to open it up to the rest of our attendees. So Cecily, if I could have you speak, that would be great.
I thank you so much to all the speakers for sharing your experiences and the experiences of the people that you work with. Just considering that This event was supposed to happen at the Convention on the Status of Women, and as Rosa mentioned, the CSW this year and a lot of work this year has been focusing on Beijing Plus 25 and the generation equality meetings that have all been kind of postponed, and the action coalitions that have been formed. How can we ensure that these vital voices and experiences that you're sharing of migrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking women are brought forward in these spaces? And Rosa mentioned refugees and asylum seekers protected under the 1951 Convention, but we know that there are migrants in vulnerable situations, especially migrant women workers and climate displaced women who are not protected under those conventions. And so how do we raise those voices and experiences in UN spaces? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cecily. We can take a few more. Okay, we have a question from Robert Key.
I'm here in Tucson, Arizona, and thanks so much, Anna and Kira, for all the work you're doing in El Paso. I can relate to all of the things that you spoke about as I do visitations to Eloy and La Palma. I just wanted to confirm to everybody that I received a message this morning from a father who has a son in La Palma. He told me yesterday that the population was quarantined, and they did confirm today that they do have a case of COVID-19 in La Palma. It's a 45-year-old Guatemalan man. So that is confirmed. So hopefully there can be some more cases of humanitarian parole because of this situation. But the people I've spoken with in Eloy, the officials are very tight-lipped. They're not saying anything, but as far as I know, there are no confirmed cases there. But I did just want to share that with everybody to know that there is a case that is in La Palma at this point. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Robert. I appreciate it. I do want to have Cecily's question answered, and I'm wondering if I can turn that to Rosa to answer Cecily's question.
Yeah, let me quickly address that. Hi, Cecily, and thank you for that question. As you know, well, perhaps you knew, just recently we got an update from the advisory board that works with UN Women on generation equality about the generation equality events, which were to take place, one meeting in Mexico as a co-host in May, and another meeting in France in July as another co-host. Both of those meetings have been postponed to 2021. So generation equality, in a sense, has been postponed to really commemorate the 25th, which in 2021, it'll be the 26th anniversary of Beijing, but all of that will take place next year. So I think that it will be important to really digest this information that people are presenting here, especially information that, thank you, Bob Key, who spoke up. Thank you, because he has been one of our strong partners in Arizona, and Mary Jean mentioned him, and you might want to say more after. This information is really vital to connect the dots, to really connect the Feminist Task Force work around generation equality in Beijing with the work that Loretto Volunteers and Loretto at the UN and the LACC are doing at the border, especially around this humanitarian paroles that can be happening now. And also, you mentioned it to us before, Mary Jean, but we know that UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is at the border. They're in Tijuana, of these volunteers that are there. So connecting with that program and ensuring that we raise this not only through the UN agencies, but also through the women in feminist, women in migration networks. I think that the work that we can take after this is really looking at this, analyzing, digesting, and seeing how we can push at the UN on these humanitarian grounds.
Okay, and I think part of Cecily's question is, what can we do now? Look, we need to get people out of those prisons. We can work with No More Deaths and call, you know, maybe get to our governors to get people out of these prisons. And there are little things like No More Deaths is asking us to call our senators and representatives and bombard them with calls to, you know, tell them that there's a confirmed case in La Palma. Tell them that the conditions in Louisiana, God knows, oatmeal 3 times a day. I mean, we've got to take it seriously and get them out wherever we are. I mean, California has a great governor, but we're not putting enough pressure on him to get people released from Otay Mesa, all the other detention centers, and not to deport them back to Mexico. And what has happened in the San Diego area. No, they need to be able to get to their sponsors.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Mary Jean.
Thank
We
you.
have one more question from the chat.
I was just wondering during this time right now if there are any initiatives or programs to protect vulnerable women and children from sexual abuse. You mentioned something was mentioned about like partner violence, but I'm just wondering about other kinds of abuse that can happen during these times, especially if there's, you know, people are going to be segregated or on lockdown in places. I just worry about that and wondering if anyone is paying attention to this.
Yes, that's a really important question. And I'm wondering if our Loretto volunteers know of any programs or processes for that?
Like in general, or like particularly like migrant women?
Yes, migrant women.
Migrant women. I don't know of anything. I really don't.
I'm wondering if you're meaning within at the border or within the detention centers. I'd like a little bit more clarification on that.
Well, it could be in the detention centers. I don't know how many women are actually in those detention centers, but also at the border and some of these spontaneous camps that have been set up. And there aren't a lot of resources, and when that happens, there tends to be a lot of sexual exploitation and abuse of women and children in those situations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I know that in my research, I noted that 70% of the migrants, those trafficked are women and girls. So there is a high rate. There's also men who may identify as gay or are perceived to be gay, who are also persecuted. I know that in our visits across the border, we know that there are programs that are in place, but for actual implementation and practice of it is very difficult to say if that's happening,
No.
whether there is protection. but also I think that we have heard of that abuse in the detention centers. It's a very difficult thing to prove, and especially now with the prohibition of going into the detention centers. But I know that that is something that we have heard is happening. And I think that, you know, raising the flag and ensuring that, especially now, that we are looking more closely to about that is something that, you know, we have to ensure to try to include.
Thank you, Rosette. So we have one more question, and I think this will probably be the last one, from Abby Brickler.
Oh, hi, I'm Abby. I'm from St. Louis and also a proud NGO alum. I was wondering what you would say to a youth advocate who cares deeply about issues at the border and wants to have productive discussions with family members who agree more with our president and are more hard-headed when it comes to this topic. Also, to go off a previous question, what can we do now to bring more awareness to these issues?
Wonderful question. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Kiara and Anna first, and then if any other panelists also want to add in, feel free.
My initial thoughts right now are with the coronavirus, one thing is, right, people are saying there are no walls, it affects everyone. And so maybe like thinking about it in that way and breaking down the barriers and the binaries and who's who in different groups and stuff. I think that the way I think about like as people that are seeking asylum and migrants is that I look at it as a humanitarian rights. And so when the things that we've shared today, you know, whether or not like, I don't know, family members know, just like the smaller details and the experiences that people have aside from their identities and where they come from, and just maybe trying to see it on that level.
I would say like just turn it to like facts and law, like people that have opinions like that aren't very well informed of like the US and how they intervened in Latin America, how they like staged a coup in many Central American countries, and that's why people are fleeing. And how like a lot of these things are like very blatantly like illegal. Like according to the Constitution, like you can't imprison someone who hasn't been accused of a crime, which a lot of these people have not. Like they're seeking asylum, which is legal according to international law and according to many things that the US has signed on to. So it's like, it's just blatantly like illegal. Like the courts, like how they have really little access to like their family members. They can't gather evidence for their court cases. They can't talk to lawyers because they're in prison. Like that's a blatant violation of like due process. It's in violation of our Constitution. It's in violation of like everything that we like claim to be as a country. And I mean, I think for the most part, like that's how like I would approach it. Like it's just like these are things that are illegal. Also, like our tax dollars are going to fund these detention centers, and it's just a waste. Like they could be going to a lot of other things. When like these people that are detained have sponsors, have like legal permanent resident or citizen sponsors that are like tax-paying citizens that could be taking care of them, while like we just fund like these prisons for them.
Before you go, I want to give a brief response to Abby's question, if I may. Abby, thank you so much for the question. I too am a proud graduate of Narings Hall High School in St. Louis. And a very specific thing that I could recommend to the youth advocate that you're talking about is that he or she could be invited to accompany us on one of our border experience trips. Because the firsthand encounters and stories that people acquire on these trips and can come back and then speak to family members from this base of, I was there and I personally spoke to people and here's what I want you to understand about their stories. Even better, these family members could be invited to come on one of our Loretto experience trips as well, because that's the only power that we have, is to communicate person to person based on our personal experiences.
We do have one last piece of our webinar today, and that is with Beth Blissman leading that, talking about some action steps and resources. So Beth, go ahead and take it away.
We appreciate this time for intergenerational dialogue. And Amy, if you could please put up our 2 slides of resources. We have gotten some links and resources together for people. We've put some links to the various groups that we're involved with here. And we would like to hear from you as well, because we realize we're not the only folks doing this work, and we're not the only folks with connections to people doing this work. And just a quick answer as well, or a quick thought to whoever it was from St. Louis, I'm missing it on the chat, who asked the question about ways to get involved. There's also a group called the Catalyst Project that does wonderful, amazing anti-racism work. So you might want to check out the Catalyst Project. We can add that to our additional resources as well. So at this point, thank you for your time, all of you who have hung in with us. We deeply appreciate it, and we will be sending this information out to you. Do please feel free to send us other organizations that you work with or that you might know about that we would wish to add to our list of resources, so we can all continue to stay well, be well, and continue to do this work and support each other in doing it. Thank you very much for your time.